Eastbourne, a Victorian seaside town situated in the south of England, in West Sussex. And having a lot of retired people, the medical profession tries to alleviate any ailments of elderly patients as best they can. But for one doctor in the 1940s, there were serious allegations of a complete disregard of the Hippocratic Oath, as he was accused of willful murder, who profited from his patients. Dr. Bodkin Adams was accused of being a fraudster and serial killer. The trial was reported around the world and was said to be one of the greatest of all time. This is Vintage Murders, and the chilling account of the deadly doctor, his patients, and their legacies. Adams was born in 1899 in Randalstown, a tiny village in Northern Ireland. His father was a preacher of a strict Protestant denomination called the Plymouth Brethren, and Dr. Adams would remain with them all his life. He graduated from Queen's University in Belfast, but was considered lacklustre by his peers. After a 6-month stint as a houseman at Bristol Royal Infirmary, which was not seen as successful, he was advised that his future as a surgeon was uncertain, and it was suggested that he become a GP. He joined a Christian medical practice in Eastbourne in 1922. In 1929, he borrowed £2,000 from one of his patients, William Marwood, and bought an 18-room residence called Kent Lodge, located in a select neighbourhood. He was a frequent visitor to the Marwood household, and it was suggested at the time that he would charge goods to the accounts held by the family at local stores without their permission. After Marwood's death, his widow later told police that Adams was always hanging around and that he was a real scrounger. During the 1930s, Dr. Adams' unconventional methods were attracting attention in Eastbourne. He was subject to a probate dispute in 1936 when he inherited £7,385 from a patient, Matilda Whitton, whose whole estate amounted to £11,465. He was successful, but a codicil giving his mother £100 was overturned. But his approach to medical science in the war years was alarming. Between 1939 and 1941, he treated a Mrs. Pike with certain drugs including morphine. Instead of getting better, she got worse. The family was so concerned that they called the landlady of the house where Mrs. Pike was residing, who in turn contacted a second doctor. He announced there was no medical reason for this treatment, and after 8 weeks she recovered her normal self. He was gaining a reputation for acquiring well-heeled clients. Among them was the Duke of Devonshire, the local deputy chief constable, and an industrialist. This begs the question, was he giving his patients drugs to alleviate suffering, or for other purposes? He was rumoured to be the richest doctor in the country, although his lifestyle was that of a standard, successful provincial doctor. Life continued in Eastbourne at a leisurely pace, as Dr. Adams routinely administered to his patients' needs. This was until the death of Mrs. Geraldine Hullett on the 23rd of July 1956. She had become depressed following the recent death of her husband, and Dr. Adams prescribed sodium phenobarbital for her. She told Dr. Adams that she wished to commit suicide, and there were letters found after her death that confirmed this fact. Adams was unavailable at the time of the lady's death, and a Dr. Harris attended the dying patient. Harris thought it could have been a drug overdose, but this was denied by Adams. They both finally agreed the cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage, on account of her dilated pupils. But it could also be the result of multiple drug overdoses. Matters would have rested there, except after years of rumours and Adams mentioned in at least 132 wills of his patients. A music hall entertainer called Leslie Hanson learnt of the unexpected death of his friend, Gertrude Hullett, a few months earlier, and that Dr. Adams was the doctor. He anonymously called the police, who in turn called Scotland Yard. Investigations concentrated on the period of 1949 until 1956. A Home Office pathologist examined 310 death certificates of Dr. Adams and concluded 163 needed further examination. Some 42% of the 310 patients supposedly died of cerebral hemorrhage, against the national average of 15%. The majority of the suspicious certificates stated that the patients died in a coma, which could suggest either narcotics or barbiturate poisoning. On the 23rd of July 1956, 2 weeks after Mrs. Hullett died, the Eastbourne coroner noted that from the post-mortem, her death did not appear to be natural. The police began taking statements from individuals who had been in contact with her shortly before her death, many of whom believed that she had committed suicide. One of her friends, who was also her executor, provided 3 letters she had written in April and had placed with her will, which indicated that she had contemplated suicide even then. A second post-mortem conducted by a Home Office pathologist concluded that the cause of death was barbiturate poisoning. After this post-mortem, the investigation was taken over from the Eastbourne Police by 2 officers from the Metropolitan Police's murder squad. The senior officer was Detective Superintendent Herbert Hannam of Scotland Yard. He was assisted by Detective Sergeant Charles Hewitt. Hannam was in the unusual position that instead of having to find a suspect for a known crime, he had a known suspect in Adams, but needed to link him to more serious crimes than forging prescriptions, making false statements, and mishandling drugs. It was suggested that the doctor had murdered many elderly patients for legacies. Investigators decided to focus on cases from 1946 to 1956 only. The police took numerous statements from nurses who had treated Adams's patients and the relatives concerned. Some were generally favourable to him, but others claimed Adams had given patients special injections of substances that were unknown to the nurses and which Adams refused to disclose to them. The statements also claimed that his habit was to ask the nurses to leave the room before injections were given, and that he would also isolate patients from their relatives, hindering contact between them. During the subsequent trial, the assertions of nurses that they did not know what Adams was injecting, or that he did not give injections in front of them, was disproved by the contents of their own notebooks. In August, the British Medical Association, the BMA, sent a letter to all doctors at Eastbourne, reminding them of professional secrecy, or patient confidentiality as we know it, if interviewed by the police. The police were frustrated by this move, although some local doctors ignored it and gave statements relating to deceased patients. The Attorney General, Sir Reginald Manningham-Buller, wrote to the BMA's secretary, Angus McRae, to try to get him to remove the ban. This impasse continued until on the 8th of November, Manningham-Buller met McRae to convince him of the importance of the case. During this meeting, McRae dropped his opposition to doctors talking to the police. There were genuine concerns within the medical profession, not only about patient confidentiality, but the fear of being accused of murder while giving dangerous drugs to a patient. This case established the concept of double effect, whereby a doctor can inadvertently kill a patient whilst in his or her care. The police acted promptly, and Adams's house was searched on the 24th of November, for dangerous drugs and any other pieces of evidence. He was asked to produce his register of dangerous drugs, but not only claimed not to have one, but stated he did not have any dangerous drugs in the house. While the police searched the first cupboard, Adams was seen pocketing some items from another cabinet. When challenged, he produced 2 bottles of morphine, one of which he claimed was for Annie Sharp, who had died 2 days earlier under his care. The second was for Mr. Sutton, who had died the previous December. But pharmacy records showed that he was never prescribed any morphine. Sometime later after the trial, Adams was convicted of failing to maintain a register and obstructing the police. At an early stage in the investigation, Hannam believed he had found Adams' modus operandi. He first made his victims drug addicts, then influenced them to change their wills in his favour, and finally give them a lethal dose of opiates. The officer concentrated on those cases where Adams had been left legacies or given gifts, or had apparently stolen items from the deceased. Hannam confided to a reporter at this time that he was convinced that Adams was a serial killer who had killed 14 people. Between August and October 1956, Hannam collected a significant number of witness statements, mainly from relatives of Adams's deceased former patients, who had claimed that these had been heavily drugged by Adams and were injected with unknown substances and had become comatose or unresponsive. Adams was first arrested on the 24th of November on 13 charges, including false representation on cremation certificates, and he was granted bail. Hannam started to investigate deeper and discovered that 132 patients treated by Adams between 1949 and 1956 had made a legacy to him. He narrowed down the field to a manageable 12 and submitted their names to the prosecution. He was arrested a second time on the 19th of December and charged with the murder of Mrs. Morell. When told of the charges, he said, "Can you prove it was murder? She was dying in any event." Hannam considered he had collected enough evidence in at least 4 of the cases for prosecution to be warranted. Of these, Adams was charged on 1 count, the murder of Morell, but also the death of Mr. and Mrs. Hullett, being used to prove some sort of system was being used regarding the patients. Mrs. Morell had suffered a stroke on the 25th of June 1948 and was partly paralysed. She had moved from Cheshire to Eastbourne and was under the care of Dr. Adams before July 1948 until her death on the 13th of November 1950. He certified her death as a stroke, followed by a coma. He arranged for her to be cremated the next day, and her ashes scattered out to sea near to the coast. Her son, as sole executor, had been expected to arrange her funeral. More disturbing was the answer to the question posed on the cremation form that stated, "Have you, so far as you are aware, any pecuniary interest in the death of the deceased?" "No," he wrote. Unless he had read or been aware of a will or any codicils, then it was technically correct. The prosecution heard many rumours, but they had no hard evidence. As a doctor, he was expected to prescribe strong drugs to elderly patients in severe pain. The prosecution had only 2 local doctors as expert witnesses. They had to rely on police evidence, as well as nurses at the time of the patient's demise. The committal hearing opened in Lewes Crown Court on the 14th of January 1957. Adams was charged on the single count of murdering Mrs. Morell, but the prosecution also alleged he had killed Mr. and Mrs. Hullett in a similar fashion and introduced evidence relating to them as proof of a system. The hearing concluded on the 24th of January, when Adams was committed for trial on the Morell charge. Mrs. Hulett had written a cheque for £1,000 to Dr. Adams, as her late husband had promised him a new MG car. Instead of waiting for the cheque to be cleared in the usual way, Dr. Adams insisted that the bank cleared the cheque by the following day, which was 24 hours before Mrs. Hullett's death. Convenient. The Attorney General thought he had evidence that Adams had prescribed large quantities of opiates to Mrs. Morell. Adams's own admissions that he had used them all on Mrs. Morell and injected all or almost all of them himself. The only possible reason to inject so much over a short time was to kill her. Melford Stevenson, who led the Crown's case at this hearing, made an explicit claim that Adams's instructions to specially clear Mrs. Hullett's cheque 2 days before her death showed that he knew she was going to die very soon, using her wealth and foreseen death as evidence of critical similarities to the deaths of Mr. Morell and Mrs. Hullett. He also made an implication, unsupported by evidence, that Adams had been involved in the administration of the drugs that caused her death. Following the hearing, the Attorney General advised that he would not be using the evidence regarding the Hulletts in the Morell trial, but seeking a second indictment relating to Mrs. Hullett, which he did on the 5th of March 1957. Had this been proceeded with, a second committal hearing would have been required. The trial on the indictment relating to Mrs. Morell started on the 18th of March at the Old Bailey, with that relating to Mrs. Hullett held back for a possible second separate trial. The choice by the Crown prosecution to focus on the death of Mrs. Morell, aged 81 when she had died, surprised Detective Hannon. As she had died in 1950 and had been cremated, he thought that Mrs. Hullett would have been a more suitable choice, as she was only 50 and had died recently and had not been cremated. Also, she contained twice the fatal dose of barbiturates, which was unusual. The Hullett charge was to be prosecuted at a later date. The trial lasted 17 days, the longest murder trial in Britain up to that point. The prosecution relied on 3 things: the amounts of opiate drugs prescribed by Adams for Mrs. Morell, Adams's verbal admission that he himself had injected almost all the amounts prescribed, and statements taken from Mrs. Morell's nurses in August and November 1956. The statements of 2 nurses suggested that Adams had increased the frequency and the amount of each injection throughout the period they had looked after Mrs. Morell, and that many of the injections Adams gave were drugs taken from his bag, which he had prepared himself, and they were not aware of the contents of these injections. Another nurse recalled that these were said to be vitamins. The only people who could reliably testify as to Dr. Adams' methods were the nurses, who were questioned by the police and their notebooks taken. These notebooks somehow went missing, and only came to light when the defence produced them on the second day of the trial. The nurses had been examined on the first day, and the defence could now compare the contemporary notes with their statements. According to their witness testimony, Adams did all the injections. The notebooks told a different story, as the nurses and the doctor both injected Mrs. Morell on separate occasions. One nurse even said that she thought Dr. Adams' injections contained vitamins. The prosecution's 2 expert medical witnesses gave differing opinions. Dr. Arthur Douthwaite was the foremost authority on heroin and similar drugs used as medications, and eventually persuaded the government to ban it for medical use. He was convinced about Adams's guilt, but had to change his testimony in the middle of cross-examination, or Dr. Adams' role in the death of Mrs. Morell. Also, the second witness, Dr. Michael Ashby, was very reluctant to be precise as to the role of Dr. Adams in the death of Mrs. Morell. The defence produced its own expert witness, Dr. Harmon, who stated that the defendant's methods were unusual, but not reckless. Whilst the prosecution and defence were making their final statements, the judge received a phone call from Lord Chief Justice Goddard, stating that if Adams was found innocent, he should be granted bail ahead of the forthcoming Hulett trial. This would have created a legal precedent, as no person standing trial for murder had ever been granted bail. On the 9th of April 1957, the jury returned their verdict after 44 minutes to find Adams not guilty. The prosecution decided they would not proceed with the Hulett case. Adams had been engaged to Nora O'Hara between 1933 and 1935, but they never married, although they remained friends for life. A journalist was going to publish an article, without naming names, entitled "A Policeman, a Magistrate, and a Doctor." The policeman was the Deputy Chief Constable of Eastbourne, Alexander Seekings. The magistrate was Roland Gwynn, who visited Dr. Adams every day at 9 a.m, and even went on holiday with him several times to Scotland. It was suggested that there was more to this than met the eye. As homosexuality was illegal in the 1950s, this was a serious charge, but was ignored by the prosecution. Homosexuality was often used as a means of blackmailing prominent people in the local community. So what happened to Dr. Botkin Adams? The 50s were the glory days of checkbook journalism. The crime reporter of the Daily Express, Percy Hopkins, was the only one in Fleet Street believing in Adams' innocence. He was whisked away to a secret location for 2 weeks to give his version of events, and was handsomely paid. The reporter received a £1,000 legacy in Dr. Adams' will, which he gave to charity. The money that Adams received for the story was never spent, and lay undisturbed in a bank vault until his death. It's worth mentioning Mrs. Annie Sharp, who was the proprietor of a boarding house where at least 2 of Adams's victims had resided. He had cut both of them off from their relatives and prevented them from receiving their post. Sharp herself tried to get one of her boarders to invest £5,000 in her business, but only got £200. She and Adams were the only people present during the burials. After interviewing Sharp, Detective Hannam considered her as a key witness and thought she was the answer to the whole matter, suspecting she was money-grabbing and in collusion with Adams. While the original investigation was underway, Sharp was suddenly found to have, by Adams, cancer in her abdomen, and she died a few days after this diagnosis, in November 1956. Her body was cremated. He resigned from the NHS and was convicted in Lewes Crown Court on the 26th of July 1957 of 8 counts of forging prescriptions, 4 counts of false statements on cremation forms, and finally 3 counts under the 1951 Dangerous Drugs Act. Later that year, he was struck off the General Medical Register. After 2 failed applications, he was finally readmitted on the 21st November 1961. In the meantime, he had kept his patients in private practice, but could only administer over-the-counter medicines. After his readmission to the medical profession, he was able to prescribe stronger drugs. He applied for a visa to the United States, but was refused because of his dangerous drugs convictions. In later years, he became president and honorary medical officer of the Clay Pigeon Shooting Association. On the 30th of June 1983, he fractured a hip when shooting and had to go to Eastbourne Hospital, where he died of a chest infection. He had continued receiving legacies up until the time of his death.